Welcome back to HalidonMusic's podcast series on the Baroque Era. My name is Sarah Joy, and you are listening to episode 5, where we will be discussing the different vocal genres during this time period, which was roughly between 1600 and 1750. Before we get started, I want to let you know that Halidon did put together a lovely Spotify playlist of all of the pieces that we have included in this series, and in the podcast itself, we only play cuts and clips of those pieces. But if you'd like to listen to the full recordings, you can do that by going and listening to that playlist. The first vocal genre of the Baroque era that I want to talk about is opera. Now, I'm going to reference back to a term that I used in episode 2, I believe, which is monody. And monody specifically is one voice accompanied by basso continuo. Now, why is monody so important for opera, you might ask? And that is because monody allowed one voice, one person to represent a single character on stage. So I've talked a lot about polyphony so far in this series. And if you will recall, polyphony is whenever you have multiple lines happening at the same time of equal importance, and it would of course require more than one singer. And so if you were to try to have opera in the polyphonic style, you would need multiple people to represent a single character, which just doesn't work. But with monody, that is completely possible. Now, another term that I want to introduce is recitative. And I'm actually going to just read you what the Merriam-Webster dictionary, how they define it. A rhythmically free vocal style that imitates the natural inflections of speech and that is used for dialogue and narrative in operas and oratorios. Basically what that is that they were able to say a lot of text to move the plot forward very quickly. Now, let's talk briefly about the history of opera. Monteverdi, which I'm really excited to talk about his life. I have a brief biographical overview of him planned for a future episode, but he was actually the composer of what was considered probably the first successful opera, Orfeo. And the reason for Orfeo's particular success is that Monteverdi managed to use varied instrumentation to actually paint scenes with music. He was very experimental and creative in terms of his arranging. So for example, in the underworld scene, where it's supposed to be very, dark and kind of spooky, he used lower range instruments to really bring that vision to life on the stage. Now, referencing back to episode 1, where I talked about the courts and the churches, opera had its origin in the courts. The courts used the genre of opera as a great way to display their wealth, really flaunt what they could do with their special effects, their new technologies. On the religious front, in Rome, the church saw operas as a great way to convey biblical messages. Eventually, though, it did make its way into the public through the establishment of public opera houses. And the first one was established in Venice in 1637. Now, it's important to note that the operas written for the courts were much, much different from the operas written for the public. In the courts, the operas were they were much more serious. They were often based on mythological stories and characters. They were they focused on stateliness and nobility. But then for the public, they included much more comedy. There were a lot more comedic elements. So as I was saying, Italy was the birthplace of opera, but other countries were also developing their own forms of dramas that were sung dramas. Now, in England, they had what was called semi-operas, which was basically a mix of dialogue as well as musical numbers. So it was a play with musical numbers built into it. They also had what was called the ballad opera, which, again, I didn't read this anywhere, but to me, it makes sense that this was basically the predecessor to our modern day musicals. So what it consisted of popular tunes written or melodies written in a popular style that were mixed with spoken dialogue. So to me, this is just like a modern musical where the musical numbers are written in a at least more popular style, and it's integrated just with dialogue. All right, we still have quite a few genres to get through, but the next one I want to talk about is the madrigal. And again, the birthplace of the madrigal was Italy. And madrigals had a very long and rich history that extended back before the Baroque era. And typically they were a cappella, polyphonic. Number of singers could range from 2 to 8, but typically it was 3 to 6. And that was all typical how it was during the Renaissance period, early Baroque. But in the transition from Renaissance to Baroque, thanks to Monteverdi, madrigals became much more experimental. So the addition of basso continuo, the implementation of monody, and again, I believe I talked about this in episode 1 or 2, maybe 2. Yes, 2. The composers, and specifically Monteverdi in this case, he was concerned about highlighting the text. So everything that he wrote was in support of the text to make sure that you could really, truly understand what was being stated. Monteverdi was very prolific in his writing of madrigals, and again, very experimental. His later madrigals, I can't remember which book it was because he produced quite a few books of madrigals. But in some of his later ones, he did actually reference back to the older style of polyphonic madrigals. So that's one of the things that I love about Monteverdi. He was just willing to try new things and even willing to go back to the older ways of doing things, pretty much just whatever seemed interesting to him at the time. The last genres that I want to talk about are primarily sacred, although some of them have been used in secular settings. And the first one in this category is the oratorio, not to be confused with opera. So here's the main difference. In Catholic countries during Lent, and I believe when was it? In Advent, yeah, of course. Advent and Lent, during this time, Catholic countries did not permit any operas. So instead, composers turned to writing oratorios, which were very much like operas, except that there was no dancing, typically no costumes, staging, anything like that. And the best known oratorio is Handel's Messiah. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this recording example of Handel's Messiah. Next up are motets, spelled M-O-T-E-T, and they are single movement. So a motet is just one movement, and they are written for a polyphonic choral group. These could also be secular, but again, primarily religious, primarily sacred in nature. The last genre is the cantata. Again, could be secular or sacred, but generally religious. And Bach is a great example of someone who wrote incredible cantatas. I don't know who referred to them as such, but they've been known as his, quote, musical sermons. Now, cantatas were multi-movement compared to motets. So cantatas could consist of arias, recitative, choruses. So again, very, very similar to operas, but much, much shorter than operas, much shorter. And the drama is spiritual. It doesn't really rely on individual characters in the story. And it also doesn't rely on costumes and the like. So it is kind of easy, if you're not well versed in these, to confuse operas, oratorios, and cantatas. But cantatas are much shorter. Oratorios are similar to operas, but without all of the fancy dressings and frills and all of that. And then motets were just single movements. And you could actually have motets inside of cantatas as perhaps, the opening number. Okay, so I covered all of the genres that I wanted to in today's episode. There are others during this time period, but I figured that these were probably the most important to know about. And of course, all of these have roots that go back much further than the Baroque period, but this is kind of how things looked during this particular time period. So I hope that you found this to be informative and fun to listen to. So I hope you're enjoying this series so far, and stay tuned for episode 6, where we talk about the instrumental genres. Thank you for listening.